Welcome back to FreightWaves. Now on this Wednesday morning, it is time to catch up with our host of Cyberly, Blythe Brumleve, our digital content expert. Blythe, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
It's great to have you as always, and you are our social media expert, our digital marketing expert, and today we're talking a little bit about the combination of the two of them, taking a really interesting look at things when it comes to YouTube, now trying to bring back their audience and reel them in. What can you tell us about what's going on?
Sure. So YouTube made some waves earlier this week whenever they announced that they are going to actually be paying select podcasters to add a video component to their show and bring it to YouTube. I think YouTube has faced a little bit of usage down or usage deterrence to other platforms with exclusive podcaster deals. Joe Rogan is notably one of those where he garners, millions of views every single day. And so losing that equivalent of a Taylor Swift album that drops every single day, losing the equivalence of that kind of listenership to other platforms like Spotify, it's sort of it's proving the model of podcasting as a whole, where a lot of audiences are just becoming frustrated with mainstream outlets and sort of the mainstream players, Fox News and CNBC and some of these other channels, that their users are lessening there and growing in other areas, podcasting being one of them. And so with this investment that Google is trying to pay podcasters in order to invest in the video equipment that is needed to move your podcast from an audio only experience to adding a video component, they're paying thousands and thousands of dollars to these podcasters in order to offset those video costs. So in hopes that they would bring their shows to their platform in order to get some of that user base back. I think YouTube is great for, those 10, 15 minute long videos, but where they're lacking is where those long form content and that long form conversation takes place. So YouTube is getting into the mix. There's also TikTok has a job posting for a podcast producer that they just hire, or that they're looking to hire. LinkedIn is also getting into the podcasting world, where their CEO just started up his own podcast specifically on the LinkedIn platform. And so there's probably, some breadcrumbs are being placed out that LinkedIn is going to be moving into the audio space as well. So podcasting is growing, and a lot of these other platforms are either, they're going to get caught, sort of holding the bag a little bit, or they're going to be proactive and try to get some of these creators to move from an audio only experience to adding a video component, which video is king as far as content is concerned.
So, Blythe, I'm interested in that statement, the video is king, because when I think about podcasts, I think about content that is typically like 45 minutes to an hour worth of content, and you're consuming it in the background most times. Like I listen to my podcast while I'm cooking, or while I'm driving, or on a walk with my dog, or just sitting outside, and I listen to a podcast so that I don't have to sit there and stare at a screen for an hour to consume that same amount of content. So, do you think that this is kind of a good play into the long form video, I guess, because it does get kind of boring. I say boring as we sit up here and do a 2-hour video show every morning, but it can almost get kind of boring where you're looking at an hour of two people just sitting in the same space, the same room, no graphics, nothing, and you're just watching them speak into a mic with each other, right?
Well, I think YouTube in particular is unique in that you can have two people that are just sitting in front of a microphone talking, and that's fine. But it's one of those things where YouTube has specialized in having the audio playback, even if you're not watching it. So you can turn your phone off like a podcast and still be able to listen to it. But there are moments, especially in my own listening habits, where I'll use an example of there was a Princess Diana podcast that talked about all of her famous outfits that she wore over the course of her life. And so I want to listen to that podcast, but they added a blog to it with all of the images that they were referencing in the show. And so having that visual component was really helpful in that certain circumstance. But then you're also, it goes right back to your point where you want to have that unintrusive listening experience, because you can do other things, unlike, say TikTok or LinkedIn or some of these other social platforms where you really have to be engaged in looking at the screen. And I think the way that they get around this is you'll have shows that have these long form content. So they'll have like an hour or two long show. And what they'll do is after they have that 2-hour show, they'll splice it up into 10 to 15 minute long segments. And then they will have one channel for the full podcast, and then they'll have another channel just for their clips. And a lot of times the clips is what draws people in to listen to the full length episode, where there might not be that B-roll or those images or those videos that they're playing during the show, but it brings them into the long form content, and then eventually will bring them in, hopefully, I guess, according to the podcasters, eventually bring them into maybe being a Patreon subscriber, an email subscriber, following them on other social platforms. So using YouTube as that sort of crux to give them almost like the old school, like drug dealers, give them a little bit and then they'll come back for more.
And Blythe, can you talk to that a little bit more? Because when I think of where digital content is going and creators are going, it almost reminds me of streaming platforms, where you can have different streaming platforms. You don't have that mainstream cable package. And now I start to think of, all right, get away from some of the mainstream news outlets, and I can support some of my podcast or content creators that I really enjoy. Now, some of those podcasters and content creators are going to be beholden to sponsorships, and now they're going to have to really kind of keep their content sponsor friendly, even if their audience really wants them to maybe push a certain topic a little bit further. Maybe their hands are a little bit tied, and it kind of starts to get back into that mainstream media-esque kind of feel. Can you talk to some of the brand building ways and some ways people are getting around this, especially with Patreon or being able to individually support certain creators as they continue to expand their brand?
Yeah, it's actually a really fascinating thing that I have watched take place over the last couple of years, because there was a certain news program that I watched all of the time, and they went out on their own. It's a show called Breaking Points. It's a news-based show, and what they did is they went that route. They went the independent subscriber route so that they could cover the topics that they really care about. Because what goes on with some of these other platforms is that you have a small amount of people that are the quote-unquote fact checkers, and they're the ones that are going to be determining if the experts that you have on your show are credible or not. They don't necessarily have those bases to make those judgments on a wide-ranging scale of topics. And so what happens is that for a lot of these mainstream news platforms, you are beholden to your advertisers. But if you go the independent route, say Patreon, say Supercast is another one where podcasters are monetizing their content. And if you take that route, then you're beholden to your listeners. And so when you're beholden to them, then you can talk about things that you freely want to talk about. And it might be something that YouTube will get upset about and probably demonetize your video. Whereas before, if you got demonetized, you would probably, as a creator, stay away from that topic in the future. But this independent listener funded route is really giving freedom back to the original creators that, hey, I can talk about this in a nuanced way, bring on experts and really flesh out some of these ideas in a long form way, and not have to worry about if LinkedIn doesn't like this particular content, or if YouTube doesn't like this particular content, because they're upsetting their advertisers. So now these creators don't necessarily have to worry about that. They can be beholden to their audience and their audience only, which I think is really exciting for creators to see some of these use cases being tried out and building that presence in public. So then that way it has a pathway for other creators that you can break through, and that you can have these in-depth conversations on topics that you are well versed in, or you can bring folks on that are well versed in, and not be fearful of YouTube's advertisers that are going to take this video down because they don't like it.
I want to finish this up really quickly by framing it in the idea of specifically freight content creators, because it seems like we've all seen an incredible rise in the pop-up of specific content creators for our industry, and obviously that audience is incredibly nuanced, but that also seems to leak out into the general public. Sometimes gets them interested in supply chain, say la vie, they come to FreightWaves, they're part of our audience as it is. But when you've got these freight content creators, they're now beholden not only to their individual audience, but they're also beholden to their company and what their company is wanting them to create content for as well. I'm thinking of like What Not to Miss with Chris from Chris Seeds at Bridge Logistics, right? So can you talk a little bit about having that kind of constraining component and where that leaves freight content creators in a positive versus negative, benefit versus detraction of which platforms to use?
I think you hit the nail on the head. The growth that has happened within the freight industry, especially among creators, has been astronomical. It's something that I sort of attribute a lot to the sports world when years ago when sports personalities first got on these social media platforms and started joining other companies, and then they're beholden to those other companies. Whereas in freight, what happens is that you have a lot of creators out here that want to get something started, but from a business perspective, you have to sort of be cautious, and that the person you're putting in charge of this content, that they will be with your company for a little while, because what happens is that if you make them the face of your company and they're the ones doing all these interviews and creating all of this stuff for you, then they go and leave and maybe start their own thing, or they go to another company, then that's the face of your company leaving. Whereas if you are working at a company and you are invested, say you're an executive, you're a high level, maybe a company owner, then that's where I would say the real magic is because you're going to be the face of that company. You're going to be speaking on behalf of that company. And so what the stories you can focus on are the stories from your customers and from the relationships that you've built with vendors and also employees as well. That's where the storytelling can really take place from that lens, because your drivers, your workers within the office, your customers, all of these different people have different stories to tell. So I think from a company perspective, that's more of the safer area to play in. Where it starts to become a little bit more challenging, I think, for a lot of creators, is when you start dipping your toes in the news of the world, because it really is a different skill set. Because before, you're just having conversations with customers, while on the flip side, if you start dipping your toes into the news of the world, you really have to sort of take that onus on yourself, that you're going to do your due diligence and you're going to do your research so that you can be seen as somebody that's trusted.
Well, Blythe, it's always amazing to have you on. What time and day can people check you out on the FreightWaves Airways?
Every Thursday, 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We've got a great show for you tomorrow. We're talking with Venusverse co-founders. They are the first sort of incubator educational platform and NFTs for women. Because I think a lot of folks, they know that like crypto space is sort of like for crypto bros, but Venusverse is hoping to change that with the education as their first priority. So I'm looking forward to having that conversation.
Well, I got to tune into that one. Thanks, Blythe. We'll catch up with you again next week.
Thank you so much.